So yeah, I'm not terribly happy with this Top Rank Dazn deal. I was, honestly, I think a lot of boxing fans were happy when Top Rank lost their broadcasting deal. It's just too many cooks in the kitchen. The fewer cooks in the kitchen, the better at this point for boxing fans. Like I said, we're already in the midst of this Zuffa quote unquote takeover that, Dana White, I mean, it's far from surprising that Dana White is having a hard time seeing things from a fighter's perspective. But this is not the UFC. Just because you have some of the top fighters in the game does not mean that the rest of the fighters on the planet are all going to flock to you for no reason. And, you saw last week a few outlets and, just the boxing sphere reporting that Anthony Joshua was going to sign with Zuffa. And, it's not a bad time if you're somebody who doesn't have a big following to make up that story because, of course, Zuffa Boxing needs to sign Anthony Joshua if they want to eventually make the Fury versus Joshua matchup that has been, speculated for so long. It's one of the, big fights that hasn't been made of this whole, big fight, Turkey Al-Sheikh Riyadh season era. And you'd figure it would be a fight that if it does get made within the next couple of years would have Dana White and Zuffa Boxing's involvement in it. So it wasn't surprising to see people trying to jump the gun on that story, but that story is not official. Anthony Joshua has not yet signed with Zuffa, but, you can't be surprised. Zuffa are trying to become, the body that puts on those big fights here and, maybe this post such direct Saudi involvement era, because that's the sense that I'm getting, right? The Saudis invested money in the sport. They put on the big fights everybody wanted to. They put on Canelo Crawford. They found in Zuffa, an organization run by somebody in Dana White that they can use to project their influence now. They don't have to have such a direct influence through these big events that are being put on directly, basically by Turkey Al-Sheikh. They can have this association with Dana White now. But to me, it also symbolizes the Saudis pulling their involvement in the sport back a little bit. And that's something that can hardly be surprising when, of course, in a lot of the cases, these fights are free and the real money is coming from the deals with the streaming platforms. So it can hardly be surprising that maybe the most optimistic of profit, revenue projections that the Saudi had for this boxing operation, that they're not meeting those projections and they want to pull back their investment a little bit. You've seen that time and time again with, the Saudi investment in football, Chinese investment in football, just, oligarchs investing in different sports. You see them put big amounts of money and put on these big events. The big events don't make quite as much money as they wanted to, and they start to pull the funding back. And I honestly think that Zuffa Boxing and the relationship between Zuffa and the Saudis represents that reality, that the Saudi money is going to start to leave the sport a little bit. And unfortunately, I think that it's not really timing up well with this era of, freak fights or borderline freak fights that we're having, with Tyson versus Mayweather and Mayweather-Pacquiao 2 happening later this year being good examples. But of course, Joshua versus Paul happening recently is another perfect example of a freak fight. But it does feel like the freak fights get a lot more attention on social media, a lot more traction, a lot more clicks, a lot more viewers than authentic boxing, and that's a problem. Because at the end of the day, it's been made very clear by this point already that Zuffa Boxing is not really part of the traditional boxing establishment. That Zuffa Boxing doesn't really understand or have any respect at all for the traditional boxing establishment. I think Zuffa Boxing doesn't really understand, and that people that criticize the sport in this way, in the way that Zuffa Boxing are sort of doing, where it's like, well, it should just be modeled like the UFC. They should completely take away all these belts and all these promoters. And it's like, that's fair. The problem is, it's not, okay, I could hear you saying it's the promoter. The promoters are dirty on their own. That's fine. I can sort of understand that. But you can't really say that individually a sanctioning body is a bad thing. You can't really say individually either that a promoter is a bad thing, especially, every fighter can't be their own manager. You got to have managers, at least managers, promoters. Actually, really the connection between promoters, sanctioning bodies, and media outlets and streaming platforms, TV networks, whatever it is. It's the connections between all of these things and the politics of bringing all these things together that delay fights and that prevent fights from getting made for years and years. It's not any of the individual parts of the equation's fault. It's the whole system's fault. It is like politics in real life in a certain way. You can blame lobbying, sure, but you can also blame the lobbyist, the politician, and the product, and the consumer. The UFC was a very unique circumstance. It takes more than just Dana White to build an ecosystem. And all that to say right now, what if Anthony Joshua doesn't want to sign with Zuffa? What if Anthony Joshua genuinely wants to be an undisputed champion, and you know that he does? You know that that's his #1 career goal. That's impossible with Zuffa. He can't get that if he signs with Zuffa. The IBF wouldn't even give their belt to Opetaya when he fought with Zuffa, and Opetaya is the best cruiserweight on the planet. If there's a no-holds-barred policy on sanctioning Zuffa boxing fights from the sanctioning bodies, in my opinion, there's only so far that Zuffa boxing can go with signing fighters. Because I'm sorry, fighters can go around calling themselves the Zuffa boxing undisputed champion, but no one's going to take that seriously, especially imagine it in a division like heavyweight. If there were two great heavyweights and one of them was going around calling himself the real undisputed champion, he's got 1 belt and the other guy's got 5. Come on. And it's why it's on some level equally frustrating that Bob Arum and Top Rank get to keep having this deal with Dazn, get to keep being so prevalent in the boxing scene, especially when boxing fans, you've already got something like Pro Box TV putting on great fights for free. Zuffa Boxing also has fights for free. It's like, okay, it's cool that we're going to still get Top Rank, but the only good thing about Top Rank for a very long time is that it was free fights on TV, and to be honest, they were just like all the other organizations, all the other entities, shall we say, in boxing at that time, whether it be a promoter, whether it be a sanctioning body. But they were just another cook in the kitchen, with a great fighter like Terrence Crawford. They had that big role in stopping him from getting all those big fights made. And, Bob Arum, I've said for so long, he's just the white Don King. People have such a negative idea of Don King and who he was. Like, that's fair. He was a very bad person. So was Bob Arum. Bob Arum gets away with it, and I think we all know why he gets away with it, and Don King didn't. And I think that real boxing fans have every bit of the same level of spite for Bob Arum that we have for Don King, and want to see somebody new putting on these fights. It's why Pro Box TV is such a great thing, because we want to see someone new. We don't want to see more Bob Arum. It reminds me of, the NHL, where there's this joke in the NHL that, head coaches in the National Hockey League, it's just the same 32 dudes switching jobs, just shuffling, big promoters from one streaming platform to the other. And what happens when Hulu wants to put on fights and sees that, if these fights on Paramount and these fights on other platforms are getting great ratings, Hulu's going to want fights too. They'll hit up some promoter. They'll put on their own, little fight stream every Saturday night. And it'll be a whole other, cook in the kitchen, voice at the table when it's time to make a really big fight that all the fans want to see. And it's almost like, the streaming ratings, the ratings for boxing, the ratings for fights go up, and immediately, the industry just stays what the industry has always been. Man, think about all these fights we can put on for all these belts. Now that there's, 6 belts in every weight class, 5 streaming services, 5 different big promoters. The Saudis can throw around all the money that they want. It can only be so organized with that many voices and with that much money floating around in that many different hands. And that's something that Dana White doesn't really understand. You can't just come in and say that your belt is the belt. And it does feel like to me like most of this has happened recently at a time where there haven't really been that many big fights that are going to cross over into the mainstream. There aren't really that many mainstream eyes on boxing. Actually, the last big fight was really that most people would have heard about was that big Netflix Jake Paul Anthony Joshua fight, right? And I think to the casual sports fan, most casual sports fans probably think, oh man, boxing hasn't been in, such a strong state in a long time. There's all these big fights, being made. A sports fan probably thinks boxing is in a great place. All these big fights are going to keep getting made. I think behind the scenes, that reality is probably shifting pretty quickly, and people are going to be pretty surprised. And the real problem is that these freak fights paper over that. They make it seem like that's not really happening because you still have big fights that are getting into the mainstream consciousness. And with Zuffa, with the traditional bodies, with so many weight classes, with so many promoters, it's up to us boxing fans to decide who is the best to fight the best. When are the best fighting the best? And to pay attention to who that is up to. Because Dana White is trying to be that guy. And for a long time, it was obviously Turki Al-Sheikh. Is it Turki Al-Sheikh anymore? It seems to be less certain to me. And if it's nobody, if we're not sure who's really making the big fights, then you have to say, okay, how many different entities are there that can put on the big fights? Netflix, Zuffa. And what people need to realize is the way that the sport's quote-unquote structure is currently set up, which it's not really a real structure. And boxing really is the Wild West, like people say, where there is no really conventional structure like we think of with other sports. But the structure of the sport is set up towards long, dragged out, behind closed doors sagas that the fans are not privy to, determining when the fights actually get made. and it makes it harder to follow this sport than any other sport on the planet. And it always has. And that's really what they're trying to change. And they're finding out that there is simply no way to change it. The time has gone by. The things that have happened have happened. The organizations that have been created have been created. The fights that have been put on have been put on. Reputations that have been established have been well established. And the money that has been made, damn it, has very well and very long ago been made. And so Zuffa Boxing better follow up this plan they have to put on shows in the UK, get those shows out of the Apex, and start making some actual real world money with these shows at larger venues and competing against an entity like ProBox TV, who consistently, weekend after weekend, puts on great fights on free TV, because you know you've got that competition from that platform, and of course competition from Dazn as well, where you can get plenty of free fights if you just pay the monthly membership. But how Zuffa Boxing is going to go from being that free fight, free TV option to replacing the entire existing boxing infrastructure doesn't just remain to be seen. That seems completely impossible to me, honestly. Let's move on to Lester Martinez versus Emmanuel Aleem. And Lester Martinez's last fight was that fight of the year contender last year against Christian and Billy, which was a draw. I personally had him winning that fight by a round, but all three judges had different scorecards. It's definitely a fight that, you can score differently depending on what you like, and it was ended up being a real toe-to-toe slugfest, despite both fighters, I think, being competent outside fighters. But, and Billy is definitely somebody who likes to stand and trade on the inside. Martinez not adverse to it, and they ended up, essentially engaging in a war. And it was a great fight. And in my mind, this is a step back down for Martinez, an easier fight this time for Martinez, and a fight that I think he's going to win. I expect Martinez to get a knockout here in probably the first 7 or 8 rounds of this fight. Even though Aleem, not an incompetent defensive fighter, he's got a stocky build. He's pretty hard to knock down, pretty hard to knock out. There's honestly a lot to like about Aleem. Long arm despite his shorter, more stocky build, so he's a competent outside fighter. Once he gets inside, he's very comfortable on the inside, like any top-level professional fighter should be. But he definitely doesn't have the explosive hands of a Martinez. He's not the level of fighter that Martinez is. And if he's going to win this fight, it's going to have to happen at a slower pace. He's going to have to sit around on the outside and control with the jab, and I don't think Lester Martinez is going to allow that to happen. I don't think Aleem in his 30 or nearly 30 fight professional career has faced somebody as good as Martinez. All of the fighters near Martinez's level he's lost to. His highest level fights are his losses, Aleem, unfortunately. He has a very clearly defined level. He can beat people on his level. He can have very fun fights against fighters on his level. But guys with that other level of speed, that other level of tenacity, that real proper championship level pedigree, he clearly struggles against, for the same reasons that everybody struggles against those fighters. And against those guys in his career, except for his one knockout where he was knocked out in the 3rd round, he's shown an admirable toughness. But I think that Aleem is also getting to an age where, especially as a fighter who likes to move and stay on the outside and stick behind the jab more, the physical attributes that encourage toughness and that help you keep toughness against a younger, extremely hungry, and also very direct fighter in Lester Martinez, those things go a little bit. I think Christian and Billy is more of the kind of fighter who's built to fight a 10-round fight against a Lester Martinez with the body that Christian and Billy has. Where you compare that to Emmanuel Aleem, he does tend to stick to the outside and keep the tempo low, so he's never been broken down in a fight before, really. I think Lester Martinez can wear him down and give him that classic boxing experience of getting worn down into a late-round knockout, because so far in his career, I think that's something that Aleem has managed to avoid. I think this fight kind of screams that, to be honest with you, because I think Martinez can establish dominance on the outside from the start and work that in to a more dominant toe-to-toe inside performance. I think that in stretches, Aleem can make this seem like the kind of toe-to-toe war you would expect after that last Martinez fight. But I think only in stretches. I think ultimately Martinez's straights and hooks are just too much. They're too much for Aleem to deal with. And Aleem tends to more try to control the fight with the jab, whereas Martinez tends to try to pepper you with the jab and break you down with the jab. And I think that if Martinez finds a single punch that he can land consistently on Aleem here, I think there's a good chance that this fight could be over. And that once Martinez does find that one shot he can rely on, you'll see that knockout start to get built here. And like all the ProBox TV cards, I love it. I will be live for that card. Doesn't seem to be any copyright issues that will too negatively affect my channel or get my channel struck or taken down or get the video or the stream struck or taken down. That's a great thing about the fights being live on YouTube, that I can react to them live, and it's always fun to react to fights live. It's always funner when you actually have the footage. So that'll be live here tomorrow night here on NPC Fights. So like, subscribe for that. Stay tuned. Tune in for that, rather. And I will be back again for all the boxing content. Let me know if you guys see anything here in this Martinez versus Aleem fight, and what you guys think about this Top Rank Dazn deal and the Zuffa boxing situation. Do you think that we're still in this super fight era, or do you think that super fight era has now come to an end, unfortunately, and we're back to the days of too many cooks in the kitchen?